the untimely death of M.Z. Taylor. 1860 was known as the year of the Secession Convention. It was a big topic of conversation in Georgetown. There were 350 souls living in Georgetown in 1860. When in 1848 George Washington Glasscock dedicated a site for the county seat through the action of the commissioners, who had gathered underneath the tree there behind, which is unfortunately no longer there due to a storm, behind what has been relocated Old Grace Episcopal. If you drew a line north from that point to the river and a line west from that point to the river, that was the original Georgetown. And as I said, perhaps 350 souls lived in Georgetown at that time. Georgetown had a lot of growing to do. Obviously, 1861, the war comes, the conflagration, the match was lit in Fort Sumter and South Carolina, and M.Z. Taylor answered the call. M.Z. Taylor was about 20 years old, and that's what 20-year-old men did back in those days. He went off and joined Hood's Texas Brigade, which is the, I believe, and I think Martha, you will agree with me, we have I believe your title is the president of Hood's Texas Brigade Reactivated. The most decorated unit in the Confederate Army. They were Lee's shock troops. M.Z. Taylor, after a short period of time, became extremely ill. He was 166 pounds and quickly dwindled down to 80-some-odd pounds. Hood personally signed his discharge paper. They were personal friends. And he went to a military hospital where he began to recover. He came back to this part of the world and became ultimately a first lieutenant and then a captain, and served in the Western Theater of the war. All right, well, at a very young age, he experienced the burden of leadership, and it mellowed him, it matured him tremendously. In 1870, Georgetown still had a population of about 320 people, and the county of Williamson had about 6,300 people in it. Something took off from 1870 to 1880 because the county grew threefold in that decade, 300%, to 15,000 plus in population.
It was the water.
Someone says it's the water. I think it possibly had something to do with the approach of railroads and taxable property, and people who are in government want to hear this number. Taxable property went in 1870 from $2 million to $5 million, about 150% increase in taxable value. A lot of it had to do with agriculture. What was going on in politics in Georgetown in those years? Well, a big topic of conversation was, shall we vote temperance or not? And it was like today, the Democrats and the Republicans hated one another. They couldn't get along with one another. It was temperance or not that defined that era. In fact, in March of 1878, there was a temperance vote. There were 494 votes cast for local option, and there were 461 against local option. could divide those. I think for local option were those who believed in temperance, and those that voted against it believed in the saloons, actually. And later events would prove that maybe the saloons would have been helpful, but nonetheless, that controversy actually resulted in a movement to divide Williamson County into two counties. There would have been the east side, which would have been renamed, believe this or not, Willie County. And I guess the west end would have kept Williams. And of course, we all know that it's named for Three-Legged Willie, and we've heard me and others talk about Three-Legged Willie, fascinating character. There was a precinct election in Precinct 1 in May of 1893. Just happened to be about 2 weeks after the financial panic of 1893. Precinct 1 included Georgetown. There had been a great controversy for many years about all of the saloons on the square down here a couple of blocks. Being a Methodist-related institution, Southwestern was not happy about them. Methodists were leaders in the temperance movement. And so that election was held. There were 724 votes for and 473 against local option, and so Precinct 1 became dry. It was sort of a compromise, I think, between the forces of the East and the forces of the West. They could keep their precinct wet, Georgetown could vote dry. In fact, there was a deputation sent here from Taylor of 8 individuals. Several names I recognize, one in particular, Daniel Moody. You all know the governor, well, that was his son. And so Daniel Moody came over here along with 7 others. They talked to a deputation of people from Georgetown who included, and now I get the cheaters out, W.Y. Penn. Does anybody know who Mr. Penn was? He had a store on the south side of the square. I happen to have an old photograph of my mother's side of the family in a Surrey, and you can barely see Penn on the opposite side of the square from where they were. In addition to Mr. Penn, we had M.Z. Taylor. He was the community leader. Thomas Proctor Hughes, another community leader. T.B. Cochran and D.S. Cheshire. And I know I could call on a couple of people in the audience here. They could give you the background on those folks as well. Migration was a big factor in the growth of the county. Where did the migration come from? It came from Germany, Czechoslovakia, Switzerland, Moravia, Sweden, Norway, and I have learned from talking to people who are descendants of those immigrants of that time that many of them were escaping conscription into the armies of Europe. What happened in 1873 approximately? The Franco-Prussian War. Everybody was called up. You were conscripted and you had to go fight for the Kaiser or for the Emperor. And so a lot of people were not in favor of that. They had learned about the fertility of the soil in these parts, the blackland soil. And they flocked here in large numbers, which I'm sure accounts for a lot of the population growth. The African American population was not great, but it was there, primarily in the east end of the county, where they were able to obtain employment harvesting crops, large cotton crops and other grain crops. And farmers were actually able to pay wages because the value of their commodities was sufficient to enable them to pay others to help them harvest their crop. There were few Mexican immigrants at this stage, That came later, during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, during the Mexican Revolution, where so many individuals were killed during the revolution. 1877 to 78, the 4th courthouse was built. I have a photograph of that courthouse with in fact, you've probably seen it in some brochures, my grandfather standing in front of it with his horse. The horse is on the right, he's on the left. It was a beautiful courthouse. Unfortunately, and it only cost about $27,400. A bargain. It was beautiful. Had a French mansard roof. It was in the French Empire style. Unfortunately, it didn't last all that long, and that's why we have the courthouse on the square that we have currently, because it had to be condemned and taken down. There was a big controversy that surrounded the new courthouse, and that was it had no indoor toilets. And they had a public privy that was on the square, and people kept locking the privy, and because they didn't want the hoi polloi getting into the privy. You know, elected officials deserve their own privy. But the commissioners took action and said, you're not going to lock that privy, that is for the public. That issue was solved February of 1894 when a sewage system was installed, but before that there was a crop of private privies that were located around the square. Some of them were only tents, but one lawyer produced a stone privy that was on the southwest corner, and we need the archaeologists to go check that out. The jail, which is due northwest of here, adjacent to this lot, this block, was built in 1888 to 1899. It was in the style of the French Bastille, with the crenellated top, and it was quite attractive, and actually cost almost as much as the courthouse. It was a $20,000, almost $21,000 contract. There's a lot. Oh, another major issue, political issue at the time, was the fact that cattle roamed freely throughout the city, and there was a comment about that I want to read to you. This is from Dudley Snyder. Dudley Snyder, one of the great lights of Georgetown in that era, a cattle baron, one of the people that you will learn about if you study the great Texas cattle drives up the Chisholm Trail. He talked about how his first visit back in September of 1855, he said, George, and I'm quoting from an article in the Williamson County Sun from 1909. He said, Georgetown was a small but tough frontier town. There were no boys or ponies here. They were all men and racehorses. The time has come when we must make a forward movement. First, we must recognize the fact that the cow and the horse running at large on our streets is a nuisance. When we correct this evil, then we will give attention to the unsightly courtyard corral that cuts across our old campus. That's where the Williams Elementary, formerly Georgetown High School, is located. That's where the old Southwestern University main building was. It cuts it in two parts with a little 2-bit vertigo step that crosses the iron fence at the university and opens the gates. These steps are a discomfort to our visitors, a shame during the school year, and a disgrace at commencement. Just now, the old town cow stands in the way of much of this progress. And thus said Dudley Snyder. There's a lot more I could say. You all are fanning fairly briskly, and so I'm going to cut it short, but believe me, I have just delighted in learning more about Georgetown in that period of time. But what I have learned is that without question, M.Z. Taylor, the man who built this building from 1867 to 1869, was a veritable engine of progress on so many different fields. The establishment of a water supply corporation. But I'm going to save that because Lynn is going to tell us about M.Z. Taylor in great detail, and I'm looking forward to that. Do we have any local dignitaries, elected officials that would like to wave their hands at us and tell us who they are here? I know we've got a bunch. And I'm not going to attempt to announce everybody, so we'll just skip that.